The morning rain drummed against the tall windows of the Riverside County Courthouse as Grace Winters climbed the marble steps with deliberate care. Her worn black flats clicked softly against the stone, a stark contrast to the confident percussion of expensive heels that would soon follow. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor, its thin contents representing what little documentation she had managed to gather in the 3 weeks since Marcus had served her with divorce papers. Before we dive deeper into this story of justice served cold, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Are you in a place where courthouse dramas like this unfold regularly, or somewhere quieter where this kind of legal warfare seems almost unreal? Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you are calling home while we watch this unfold together. Grace pushed through the heavy glass doors into the courthouse lobby, her breath forming small clouds in the overconditioned air. The security guard barely glanced at her as she placed her simple purse and folder on the conveyor belt. Everything about her screamed ordinary. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, secured with an elastic band that had seen better days. The navy blue dress she wore had been purchased from a discount retailer 2 years earlier, its polyester blend now showing subtle signs of wear at the seams. No jewelry adorned her fingers save for the thin gold wedding band that Marcus would soon demand she return. She made her way to the family court wing, her steps growing smaller as she approached courtroom 4B. Through the frosted glass doors, she could already see movement inside. The hearing was not scheduled to begin for another 15 minutes, but she knew Marcus would arrive early with his legal army, ready to establish dominance from the moment court convened. As if summoned by her thoughts, the courthouse lobby suddenly filled with the sound of confident voices and designer shoe leather against marble. Grace turned to see Marcus Winters stride through the entrance like a conquering general, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit tailored to perfection. The watch on his wrist caught the fluorescent lights, its platinum case worth more than Grace had spent on clothing in the past 5 years combined. Behind Marcus followed his legal team, 3 attorneys from the prestigious firm of Ashford, Sterling and Associates. Victoria Ashford led the procession, her red hair swept into an elaborate chignon that spoke of early morning salon appointments. Her black suit was clearly bespoke, fitted so precisely it appeared to have been sewn directly onto her tall frame. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, each stone larger than anything Grace had ever owned. In her manicured hands, she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people spend on a used car. The second attorney, a thin man named Jonathan Sterling, followed close behind with his own briefcase and an additional rolling case filled with documents. His movements were sharp and efficient, like a scalpel being prepared for surgery. The third member of their team, a younger associate named David Pike, brought up the rear with a laptop bag and what appeared to be presentation equipment. Marcus spotted Grace immediately, and his lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the coldness in his gray eyes. He whispered something to Victoria Ashford, who turned to examine Grace with the clinical detachment of an entomologist studying a particularly unremarkable specimen. The lawyer's perfectly applied red lipstick seemed to emphasize her dismissive expression as she took in Grace's discount store appearance and obvious nervousness. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks as the group approached. Marcus had always been tall, but surrounded by his legal team, he seemed to tower over everything in the courthouse lobby. His presence commanded attention from other lawyers and court staff who moved through the space. Several nodded respectfully in his direction, clearly recognizing the successful businessman and his high-powered representation. 10 minutes before the scheduled hearing time, another figure appeared at the courthouse entrance. Robert Chin moved with quiet efficiency, his simple black suit clean but clearly off the rack. His briefcase showed signs of years of use, its leather scuffed and worn soft at the corners. He was younger than Grace had expected when the court had assigned him as her public defender, perhaps in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been repaired with clear tape at the bridge. As Robert approached, Grace heard Victoria Ashford lean toward Marcus and speak in a voice just loud enough to be overheard. "So this is the best the state can provide. How charmingly David versus Goliath, though I suspect the outcome will be rather different this time." Her laugh was musical but sharp, like crystal breaking in slow motion. Robert either did not hear the comment or chose to ignore it as he approached Grace with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters. I apologize for cutting it close, but I was reviewing the latest filings until quite late last night." His voice carried a slight accent that Grace could not quite place, and his manner was far calmer than she had expected given the overwhelming odds they faced. Marcus stepped forward before Grace could respond, extending his hand toward Robert with exaggerated courtesy. "Marcus Winters," he announced as though addressing a boardroom rather than introducing himself to opposing counsel. "I believe we spoke briefly on the phone regarding discovery deadlines." His grip was firm and deliberately extended, a subtle power play that Robert navigated by matching the pressure exactly and releasing first. Victoria Ashford did not offer her hand, but instead looked Robert up and down with unconcealed amusement. "Victoria Ashford," she said simply, as though her name should require no additional introduction. "I do hope you have come prepared today, Mr. Chun. My client has a very busy schedule, and we would prefer not to drag this out unnecessarily due to any procedural confusion on your part." Robert adjusted his glasses with one finger and smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern for efficiency, Ms. Ashford. I believe you will find everything in order." His voice remained steady despite the clear condescension in her tone. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom doors and announced that Judge Morrison was ready to begin proceedings. As they filed into the courtroom, Grace could not help but notice how Marcus and his team moved with the confidence of people who had never questioned whether they would get what they wanted. Victoria Ashford's heels clicked against the floor like a countdown timer, marking each step toward what seemed like Grace's inevitable defeat. The courtroom itself felt cavernous despite being of moderate size. Dark wood paneling rose from floor to ceiling, and the morning light struggled through tall windows that faced the wrong direction. Judge Morrison was already seated at the bench, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and glasses that reflected the overhead lights. She watched the parties take their seats with the neutral expression of someone who had seen every variation of human conflict that could unfold in a family court. Marcus and his legal team claimed the plaintiff table closest to the jury box, spreading their materials across its surface with practiced efficiency. Victoria Ashford arranged her papers in neat stacks, while Jonathan Sterling set up a laptop and tablet. David Pike positioned himself slightly behind them with additional documents and what appeared to be financial charts ready for presentation. Grace and Robert took their seats at the defendant table, which suddenly seemed much smaller by comparison. Robert placed his worn briefcase on the table and withdrew a single legal pad and 2 blue pens. The contrast was unmistakable to everyone in the courtroom, from the court reporter whose fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, to the few spectators who had wandered in to observe the proceedings. As Judge Morrison called the case to order, Grace felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She knew how this appeared to everyone present. A wealthy, successful businessman with unlimited legal resources facing off against a housewife who could not even afford her own attorney. The narrative seemed so obvious that she wondered if the outcome had been determined before anyone said a word. But as the proceeding began, Grace noticed something that no one else seemed to catch. While Victoria Ashford shuffled her papers and prepared for what she clearly expected to be a routine demolition, Robert Chin sat perfectly still, his hands folded calmly on the table. His expression was not that of a man preparing for defeat, but rather someone waiting patiently for the right moment to act. Judge Morrison adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the parties before her. "We are here today for the initial hearing in the matter of Winters versus Winters, case number FC 202-48847. This concerns dissolution of marriage, division of marital assets, and child custody arrangements. Ms. Ashford, you may begin your opening presentation." Victoria Ashford rose from her seat with the fluid grace of a practiced predator. "Thank you, Your Honor." She moved toward the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that seemed designed to command attention. "What we have before us today is a straightforward case of asset division and support determination. My client, Marcus Winters, has built a substantial business empire over the past 15 years while his wife remained home as a dependent spouse. She gestured toward a stack of documents that Jonathan Sterling began distributing to the court and opposing counsel. The financial records clearly demonstrate that every significant asset, every business venture, and every investment account bears solely my client's name and represents his singular efforts and business acumen. Robert Chun accepted the papers without expression, his eyes scanning the documents with what appeared to be casual interest. Grace felt her stomach tighten as she recognized bank statements, property deeds, and business registrations that indeed showed only Marcus's name. The numbers seemed impossibly large, representing a life of luxury she had watched from the periphery but never truly participated in according to these official documents. Victoria continued her presentation with surgical precision. The defendant has no documented employment history, no professional qualifications, and no demonstrable contribution to the accumulation of marital assets. She has been entirely dependent upon my client's generosity and business success for her standard of living. The financial disclosure clearly shows that Mrs. Winters has no independent income, no retirement savings, and no significant personal property beyond basic household items and clothing. David Pike activated a presentation screen that displayed a series of charts and graphs. The visual representation was devastating in its clarity. Marcus's business ventures showed steady growth and substantial profit margins. His investment portfolio demonstrated sophisticated financial planning and strategic decision-making. In stark contrast, Grace's financial profile appeared as a virtual blank space on the documents. "Your Honor," Victoria said, turning toward the bench with practiced authority, "we are prepared to offer a reasonable support arrangement despite the defendant's lack of contribution to the marital estate. My client recognizes his moral obligation to provide basic living expenses, though the law certainly does not require him to maintain her in the lifestyle his hard work has provided for their family." Grace felt heat creep up her neck as every person in the courtroom absorbed this clinical dissection of her apparent worthlessness. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily across her machine, permanently recording each humiliating detail. Two elderly women in the back row of spectator seats exchanged knowing looks, clearly drawing their own conclusions about the kind of woman who could live so comfortably while contributing so little. Marcus himself sat with the bearing of a man who had built an empire through his own intelligence and determination. His expression conveyed patient resignation, as though he were merely fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary obligation to a dependent who had outlived her usefulness. When Judge Morrison invited him to provide testimony, he rose and moved to the witness stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight and authority. After being sworn in, Marcus positioned himself comfortably in the witness chair, his expensive suit impeccable even under the harsh courtroom lighting. Victoria approached with a series of questions designed to establish his credentials as a successful entrepreneur and long-suffering husband. "Mr. Winters, please tell the court about your professional background and business accomplishments," Victoria prompted with the tone of someone introducing a keynote speaker rather than examining a witness. Marcus cleared his throat and addressed Judge Morrison directly, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless boardroom presentations. "Your Honor, I founded Winters Technical Solutions 15 years ago with a small business loan and an idea for streamlining corporate data management. Through careful planning and 7-hour work weeks, I built it into a company that now employs over 200 people and generates annual revenues exceeding $40 million. He paused to let the impressive figure settle in the courtroom before continuing. "During this entire period, my wife chose to remain at home. While I certainly respected her decision to focus on domestic responsibilities, the financial success of our family has been entirely dependent upon my professional efforts and business decisions." The testimony continued with Marcus detailing acquisition deals, strategic partnerships, and expansion initiatives that had built his business empire. Each accomplishment he described seemed to diminish Grace further by comparison. He spoke of 18-hour days, international travel for client meetings, and complex negotiations that required expertise she clearly did not possess. Victoria guided him through a litany of specific examples. "Mr. Winters, during the development of your proprietary software platform, what role did your wife play in the technical development or business strategy discussions?" Marcus shook his head with what appeared to be patient sadness. "None whatsoever. Grace has never shown interest in the technical aspects of my work. When I would discuss business challenges or opportunities, she would typically change the subject to household matters or social plans. I learned early in our marriage that my professional concerns were simply outside her area of interest or capability. The court reporter continued her steady transcription while Grace felt herself shrinking smaller in her chair with each devastating revelation. According to Marcus's testimony, she had been nothing more than an expensive pet, maintained in comfort while contributing nothing of value to their shared success. When Victoria yielded the witness for cross-examination, the courtroom fell silent as Robert Chun rose slowly from his seat. He approached the witness stand with his hands clasped behind his back, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the overhead lights. Unlike Victoria's commanding presence, Robert moved with quiet deliberation that seemed almost tentative by comparison. "Mr. Winters," Robert began in his gentle voice, "you mentioned that your wife chose to remain at home during your business development years. Did you and Mrs. Winters discuss this arrangement, or was it a decision she made independently?" Marcus shifted slightly in the witness chair, his expression suggesting mild surprise that such an obvious point required clarification. "We discussed it, certainly. I made it clear that building the business would require my complete focus and availability. Grace understood that someone needed to manage the household responsibilities and that my earning potential far exceeded any income she might generate." Robert nodded thoughtfully and consulted his legal pad, though Grace noticed he seemed to be reading notes that he had written before the hearing even began. "During these business development years, did Mrs. Winters ever suggest alternative arrangements or express interest in participating in your professional activities?" "I believe she understood her limitations," Marcus replied with what sounded like patient condescension. "Grace never pursued higher education beyond high school, and business development requires sophisticated understanding of market analysis, financial planning, and strategic positioning. I could not risk the company's success by involving someone without the necessary background or expertise." Robert continued his questioning for several more minutes, but his inquiries seemed almost perfunctory compared to Victoria's devastating presentation. He asked about household management, child-rearing responsibilities, and social obligations, but each answer only reinforced the impression that Grace had lived a life of comfortable dependence rather than meaningful contribution. When cross-examination concluded, Victoria rose for redirect examination with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Winters," she said, "in your expert opinion as a successful businessman, what would be an appropriate level of support for someone with my client's background and demonstrated capabilities?" Marcus considered the question with the gravity of someone calculating the fair market value of a used appliance. Given Grace's lack of professional experience, job skills, or educational credentials, I believe basic living expenses would be more than generous. Perhaps $1,500 per month would allow her to maintain a modest lifestyle while she determines whether she wishes to develop some form of employable skills. The figure seemed to echo in the courtroom like a gavel strike. Grace felt her vision blur slightly as she absorbed the transformation from comfortable wife to charity case, receiving what amounted to pocket change from the empire she had watched Marcus build during their marriage. As Marcus returned to his seat, Victoria announced that the plaintiff would rest pending presentation of additional financial documentation. Judge Morrison nodded and turned toward the defense table with an expression that suggested she expected very little in response to the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. Robert Chin remained seated for a long moment, seemingly lost in thought as he reviewed his notes. The courtroom waited in silence while he appeared to consider his next move. Grace noticed that despite the devastating testimony they had just witnessed, Robert's demeanor remained curiously calm, almost contemplative rather than defeated. Finally, he rose and addressed the court with quiet respect. "Your Honor, the defense reserves the right to present additional evidence and testimony after we have had the opportunity to thoroughly review the plaintiff's financial disclosures. We would request a brief continuance to ensure that all relevant information is properly examined." Victoria's objection was swift and sharp. "Your Honor, we have provided complete and comprehensive financial documentation. Any delay tactics at this point seemed designed solely to postpone the inevitable resolution of this matter. My client has been more than generous with both his time and his financial transparency." Judge Morrison considered the request with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Chun, How much time are you requesting for your review? Robert adjusted his glasses with one finger, a gesture that Grace had begun to recognize as characteristic. 2 weeks should be sufficient, Your Honor. We simply want to ensure that every document has been properly examined and that we present the most accurate representation possible to the court. The judge granted the continuance despite Victoria's visible frustration, and as the parties gathered their materials, Grace felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom. The spectators filed out with the satisfied expressions of people who had witnessed exactly what they expected to see. The court reporter packed her equipment with efficient movements that suggested this had been just another routine dissolution hearing. But as Grace watched Robert carefully place his papers back into his worn briefcase, she noticed something that struck her as odd. Throughout the devastating presentation and Marcus's humiliating testimony, Robert had filled nearly 12 pages of his legal pad with detailed notes. For someone who seemed to have so little to work with, he had certainly found a great deal worth recording. 2 weeks later, Grace found herself back in the same courthouse, walking the same marble steps that now felt like ascending a scaffold. The morning was crisp and clear, but the autumn sunshine did nothing to warm the dread that had settled in her chest like a lead weight. She had spent the intervening days in a haze of anxiety, jumping every time the phone rang and barely sleeping through the nights as she imagined worst-case scenarios that somehow kept getting worse. Robert Shin was waiting for her in the courthouse lobby, his appearance unchanged except for what might have been exhaustion around his eyes. His briefcase looked even more worn than before, if such a thing were possible, and Grace noticed that his shirt cuffs showed signs of fraying at the edges. Everything about him screamed overworked public defender handling too many cases with too few resources. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters," he said with the same gentle courtesy he had shown 2 weeks earlier. "I trust you have been able to rest somewhat during the continuance." His smile was kind, but did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety that had taken permanent residence in Grace's stomach. Before she could respond, the courthouse lobby once again filled with the confident sounds of Marcus and his legal army arriving for what they clearly expected to be the final battle. Victoria Ashford led the procession wearing a different but equally expensive suit, this one in charcoal gray that made her red hair appear even more striking under the fluorescent lights. Her briefcase had been joined by a second rolling case that Jonathan Sterling pulled behind him with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to bringing overwhelming firepower to legal conflicts. Marcus himself appeared even more confident than before, if such a thing were possible. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his navy suit was clearly fresh from the tailor. The watch on his wrist caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, and Grace noticed that he had added a new tie pin that probably cost more than she typically spent on groceries in a month. As they approached, Victoria's lips curved into what might have been called a smile if it had contained any warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Chun," she said with exaggerated pleasantry, "I do hope your 2 weeks were productive. We have prepared what I believe to be a more than generous settlement offer that should resolve this matter quickly and efficiently for everyone involved." She gestured to David Pike, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio that he opened to reveal a neatly typed document. "The settlement agreement," Victoria announced as though presenting a gift rather than delivering an ultimatum, "provides for monthly support payments of $1,800, which represents a 20% increase over what my client initially proposed. In exchange, Mrs. Winters would waive any claim to marital assets, business interests, or future earnings from my client's ongoing enterprises." Robert accepted the document and began reading with careful attention to each paragraph. Grace watched his expression for any sign of hope or strategy, but his face remained neutral as he absorbed what was clearly a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. Victoria continued her presentation with the confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. The agreement also provides for a modest lump sum payment of $25,000 to assist with Mrs. Winters' transition to independent living. This would be contingent, of course, on her waiving any future claims and agreeing to a non-disclosure provision regarding my client's business affairs. The courtroom had filled during Victoria's presentation, and Grace noticed that the same 2 elderly women had returned to observe the proceedings. They whispered quietly to each other while examining Grace with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. Judge Morrison called the court to order and invited the parties to present their positions regarding the proposed settlement. Victoria rose with obvious satisfaction and addressed the bench with practiced authority. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has demonstrated remarkable generosity in this offer, particularly given the defendant's complete lack of contribution to the marital estate. The monthly support payment exceeds what would typically be awarded to someone with Mrs. Winter's limited skills and prospects, and the lump sum payment provides a substantial cushion for her adjustment to post-divorce life." She paused to consult her notes, though Grace suspected the gesture was purely theatrical. "Furthermore, Your Honor, my client is prepared to execute this agreement immediately, which would save the court's valuable time and spare both parties the expense and uncertainty of protracted litigation. We believe this represents a fair and final resolution to all outstanding issues." Judge Morrison nodded and turned toward the defense table with an expression that suggested she expected quick acceptance of what appeared to be a reasonable offer under the circumstances. "Mr. Chun, does your client wish to respond to the plaintiff's settlement proposal?" Robert rose slowly from his seat, the document still in his hands as he approached the bench. "Your Honor, we appreciate the plaintiff's offer and request a brief recess to discuss the terms with my client before providing our response." Victoria's objection was immediate and sharp. "Your Honor, my client has a board meeting scheduled for this afternoon and has already accommodated the defendant's request for a 2-week continuance. This settlement offer is straightforward and generous. Any additional delays seem designed to extract further concessions rather than resolve this matter in good faith." She turned toward Robert with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Chun, surely even someone with your limited experience in complex financial cases can see that this offer exceeds what your client could reasonably expect from a contested proceeding." The comment hung in the air like a slap, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks as she absorbed the public humiliation of watching her attorney being dismissed like an incompetent child. Robert's expression remained calm, but she noticed his hand tighten slightly on the settlement document. Jonathan Sterling leaned forward from his seat at the plaintiff's table, adding his voice to the pressure campaign. "Your Honor, we have reviewed Mr. Chen's background, and with all due respect, his practice appears to focus primarily on misdemeanor criminal defense and basic family law matters. This case involves complex business valuations and sophisticated asset structures that may be outside his area of expertise. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to undermine any confidence Judge Morrison might have in Robert's ability to provide adequate representation." Grace watched the judge's expression shift slightly, as though she were reconsidering whether Robert was truly qualified to protect his client's interests in such a complex proceeding. David Pike opened his laptop and activated the presentation screen once again, this time displaying a comparison chart that showed typical settlement amounts in similar cases. The visual made Victoria's offer appear almost philanthropic by comparison, as though Marcus were voluntarily impoverishing himself out of misguided generosity toward an undeserving spouse. Marcus himself finally spoke, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone accustomed to being listened to with respect. "Your Honor, I have tried to be fair and generous despite my wife's complete lack of contribution to our financial success. This offer represents far more than she would receive in any contested proceeding, and I believe it demonstrates my commitment to ensuring she can maintain a reasonable standard of living." He turned slightly toward Grace, his expression conveying disappointed resignation rather than anger. "Grace has never worked outside the home, has no marketable skills, and has shown no interest in developing any form of professional capability. This settlement provides her with substantially more security than she has ever earned or could reasonably expect to achieve independently." The words hit Grace like physical blows, each one reinforcing her apparent worthlessness and dependence. She felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes and struggled to maintain her composure as every person in the courtroom absorbed Marcus's clinical assessment of her limitations. Victoria sensed the moment was right for her final assault. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dropping to a tone of concerned reasonableness, "we must also consider the quality of representation the defendant has received. Mr. Chen has asked for time to review documents that any attorney with appropriate experience would have analyzed weeks ago. His unfamiliarity with complex financial cases may actually be harming his client's interests rather than protecting them. She gestured toward Robert with what appeared to be sympathetic concern. Perhaps it would be in Mrs. Winter's best interest to accept this generous offer rather than rely on counsel who may not fully grasp the sophisticated issues involved in this case. The suggestion was devastating in its implications. Victoria was essentially arguing that Grace would be better off surrendering immediately than trusting her own attorney to protect her interests. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison considered this unprecedented attack on opposing counsel's competence. Robert finally spoke, his voice still gentle but carrying a new undertone that Grace could not quite identify. "Your Honor, I understand the plaintiff's desire for rapid resolution, but I must insist on adequate time to consult with my client regarding this significant decision. Perhaps a 15-minute recess would be sufficient." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive in the formal courtroom setting. "Your Honor," he said, "I think we can all see what is happening here. Mr. Chun is stalling because he knows this offer exceeds anything his client could hope to achieve through litigation. This is exactly the kind of delay tactic that wastes everyone's time and money." Victoria nodded in agreement, her expression suggesting patient exhaustion with Robert's obvious incompetence. "Your Honor, my client has demonstrated remarkable patience, but continuing to indulge these delay requests serves no legitimate purpose. The settlement terms are clear, the offer is generous, and frankly, Mrs. Winters would be foolish not to accept immediately." Judge Morrison looked down at Robert with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Chun, this does appear to be a straightforward settlement offer. What specific issues require additional consultation with your client?" Robert adjusted his glasses with one finger, a gesture that now seemed to Grace like a nervous tic rather than a confident habit. "Your Honor, there are certain procedural matters that I would like to verify before advising my client to waive substantial legal rights. A brief recess would ensure that she makes this decision with full understanding of the implications." Victoria's patience finally appeared to reach its limit. "Your Honor," she said with barely controlled exasperation, "we are discussing an $1,800 monthly support payment to someone who has never earned $1 in her adult life. The procedural complexities Mr. Chun is referring to simply do not exist in a case of this nature." She turned toward Robert with open contempt. Perhaps if Mr. Chun spent more time studying financial law and less time handling petty criminal cases, he would recognize a generous settlement when he sees one. The attack was personal and devastating, and Grace felt something inside her break as she watched her attorney being publicly humiliated. She wanted to stand up and accept the settlement immediately, to end this torture for both of them and escape the courthouse before her degradation became any more complete. But as she looked at Robert, she noticed something unexpected. Despite the brutal assault on his competence and reputation, he remained perfectly calm. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and he withdrew his cell phone, glancing at the screen as though checking for messages. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I wonder if I might have just 5 minutes to make a brief phone call regarding a procedural question that has occurred to me. I believe it may be relevant to the settlement terms being proposed." Victoria's objection was immediate and furious. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. What possible phone call could be relevant to accepting or rejecting a straightforward settlement offer?" But Robert was already moving toward the courtroom doors, his phone in his hand, and his expression strangely confident for someone who had just been professionally destroyed in open court. As he reached the doors, Grace heard him say quietly into the phone, "Yes, it is time. Please initiate the sequence we discussed." The words made no sense to Grace, but something about Robert's tone sent an unexpected shiver of anticipation down her spine. Robert Chun returned to the courtroom 5 minutes later carrying a thick manila envelope that had not been in his possession when he left. His demeanor had undergone a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The tentative uncertainty that had characterized his previous interactions was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like quiet confidence. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the overhead lights as he strode purposefully back to the defense table, and Grace noticed that his worn briefcase now seemed like a deliberate choice rather than evidence of professional limitations. Victoria Ashford watched Robert's return with obvious irritation, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," she said before Robert had even taken his seat. "Surely we can proceed with Mrs. Winter's response to the settlement offer without further delay. My client has been more than patient with these procedural gymnastics." Judge Morrison looked down at Robert with an expression that mixed skepticism with curiosity. "Mr. Chun, I trust your phone call has resolved whatever concerns you had regarding the settlement terms." Robert placed the manila envelope on the defense table and withdrew a substantial stack of documents that had clearly been organized with careful attention to sequence and presentation. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying a new authority that caused several people in the courtroom to lean forward slightly, "my consultation has indeed clarified several important issues that I believe are directly relevant to this proceeding." He approached the bench with measured steps, no longer the uncertain public defender who had been systematically humiliated just minutes earlier. "I would like to request permission to present additional evidence that may materially affect the court's understanding of the legal relationship between the parties and the validity of the claims being made." Marcus shifted in his seat, his confident expression flickering for just a moment as he tried to process Robert's sudden transformation. Victoria's objection was swift and sharp. "Your Honor, the defendant cannot simply manufacture new evidence in the middle of proceedings. Discovery closed weeks ago, and any documents that were relevant to this case should have been produced during the appropriate time period." Robert turned toward Victoria with what might have been a smile if it had not contained such cold professionalism. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "I believe you will find that these documents were indeed available during discovery, but perhaps your client failed to provide complete and accurate information regarding certain fundamental aspects of his legal status." The words seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, and Grace noticed that Jonathan Sterling had stopped organizing his papers and was now watching Robert with sharp attention. David Pike looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from bored confidence to something approaching concern. Judge Morrison gestured for Robert to proceed, and he opened his manila envelope with deliberate ceremony. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to present to the court certified copies of marriage records from the state of Nevada, specifically Clark County, showing that Marcus Winters entered into a legal marriage with one Christina Valdez on March 15, 2004. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Robert's statement began to register. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat as she tried to process what she had just heard. Marcus had been married to someone else when they exchanged vows in the small ceremony she had thought made them husband and wife. Robert continued with methodical precision, his voice steady and professional. "These records indicate that Mr. Winters' marriage to Ms. Valdez was never legally dissolved through divorce proceedings in Nevada or any other jurisdiction. According to these certified documents, Marcus Winters was legally married to another woman when he entered into his purported marriage ceremony with Grace Winters." Marcus shot to his feet, his face flushing with anger and what might have been panic. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lacking its earlier smooth authority, "this is completely irrelevant to the current proceedings. Whatever technical issues may exist regarding previous relationships have no bearing on the division of assets acquired during my relationship with Grace." Victoria had gone very still, her expression frozen as she absorbed the catastrophic implications of Robert's revelation. If Marcus had never been legally divorced from his first wife, then his marriage to Grace was invalid from the beginning. Without a valid marriage, Grace had no claim to marital assets, but more importantly for their case, Marcus had no claim to a typical divorce settlement either. Robert approached the bench and handed copies of the documents to Judge Morrison while simultaneously providing copies to the plaintiff's table. "Ms. Ashford," he said with devastating courtesy, "I believe you will find these records to be authentic and properly certified. Perhaps you would like a moment to verify them with your client." Victoria snatched the documents and began scanning them with increasingly frantic attention to detail. Her hands, Grace noticed, were no longer perfectly steady as she flipped through pages of marriage certificates, court records, and administrative documentation that appeared to support every word of Robert's presentation. But Robert was far from finished with his revelations. "Your Honor," he continued, "this brings us to the second issue that affects the court's jurisdiction in this matter. According to property records and utility documentation, Mrs. Winters maintained her legal residence at 1247 Maple Street in Riverside throughout the period of her relationship with Mr. Winters. She never established legal domicile at his primary residence, which means that even if common law marriage provisions were applicable in California, the residency requirements would not be satisfied. Grace stared at Robert in amazement as she realized he was referring to the small apartment she had kept in her own name throughout her relationship with Marcus. She had used it primarily for storage and as a quiet retreat when Marcus was traveling for business, never realizing that maintaining that separate address could have such profound legal implications. Jonathan Sterling was now frantically typing on his laptop, clearly attempting to verify Robert's claims through online legal databases. David Pike had abandoned his presentation materials entirely and was consulting what appeared to be a thick manual of California family law. Victoria finally found her voice, though it lacked the commanding authority that had characterized her earlier presentations. "Your Honor," she said, "even if there are technical irregularities regarding the marriage ceremony, California law recognizes various forms of domestic partnerships and cohabitation arrangements that would entitle the defendant to reasonable support during any transition period." Robert nodded thoughtfully, as though he had expected exactly that argument. "That brings us to the third issue I would like to present to the court," he said, withdrawing another set of documents from his seemingly endless supply. "These are certified copies of property records, purchase agreements, and title transfers showing the acquisition dates and ownership details for several assets that Mr. Winters has claimed as marital property." He handed the new documents to Judge Morrison while Victoria watched with growing alarm. "Your Honor, these records show that Mr. Winters' primary residence at 892 Oak Hill Drive was purchased on February 8, 2009, approximately 6 months before he began his relationship with Ms. Winters. Similarly, his primary business location and several investment properties were acquired prior to their cohabitation." Marcus was now conferring urgently with Victoria in whispers that were becoming increasingly audible to the rest of the courtroom. Grace caught fragments of heated discussion about documentation requirements and discovery obligations that suggested their supposedly ironclad case was developing serious structural problems. Robert continued his methodical dismantling of the plaintiff's position with what Grace was beginning to recognize as surgical precision. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the business entities that form the foundation of Mr. Winters' claimed wealth were incorporated and began operations before his relationship with Ms. Winters commenced. The corporate records show that Winters Technical Solutions filed its articles of incorporation on January 12, 2009, and signed its first major client contract on March 22 of the same year." Judge Morrison was now studying the documents with obvious interest, her earlier skepticism about Robert's competence completely replaced by professional respect for the thorough legal research he had presented. "Mr. Chun," she said, "these are serious allegations regarding the fundamental basis for this proceeding. Do you have additional evidence to support your claims about the timeline of asset acquisition and business development?" Robert's response carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had prepared for exactly this question. "Yes, Your Honor. I have bank records, business registration documents, and contemporaneous correspondence that clearly establish the chronology of Mr. Winters' financial activities. These materials show a clear pattern of asset acquisition and business development that preceded and was entirely independent of his relationship with my client." The courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the confident demolition Victoria had orchestrated earlier to something approaching chaos as the plaintiff's legal team struggled to address revelations that undermined every aspect of their case. Victoria was now frantically consulting her own files, while Jonathan Sterling continued his urgent computer research. Marcus himself appeared to be experiencing something close to panic as he realized that his supposedly straightforward divorce proceeding had become a complex legal examination of fraud, misrepresentation, and invalid marriage claims. His silver hair was no longer perfectly styled, having been disturbed by his anxious hand movements, and his expensive suit seemed to hang differently on his frame as his confident posture collapsed. Robert allowed the courtroom to absorb the implications of his revelations before delivering what appeared to be his concluding argument. "Your Honor," he said, "given these material facts regarding the legal status of the parties and the actual ownership timeline of disputed assets, I believe the court will find that this proceeding has been initiated under fundamentally false premises. Mr. Winters has attempted to claim marital property rights over assets he owned before his relationship with Ms. Winters, while simultaneously seeking to limit her legal remedies based on an invalid marriage ceremony that he knew to be legally meaningless. Victoria finally managed to formulate a response, though her earlier commanding presence had been replaced by obvious desperation. "Your Honor," she said, "even accepting these documents at face value, there remain issues of equitable distribution based on the parties' long-term domestic arrangement and shared household responsibilities during their cohabitation period." But Robert was ready for that argument as well. "Ms. Ashford," he replied, "I believe you will find that equitable distribution claims become considerably more complex when the party seeking distribution has engaged in systematic misrepresentation regarding his legal capacity to enter into marriage. The doctrine of unclean hands may well preclude Mr. Winters from claiming any equitable relief whatsoever." The legal terminology was technical, but its implications were devastating. Robert was suggesting that Marcus had forfeited his right to any favorable legal treatment by deceiving Grace about their legal relationship, while simultaneously building a case based on false premises about asset ownership and marital status. Judge Morrison set down the documents and looked directly at Marcus with an expression that had shifted from neutral professionalism to something approaching judicial skepticism. "Mr. Winters," she said, "these are serious allegations regarding your candor with this court and your legal representation of the fundamental facts underlying this proceeding. Do you wish to respond to the evidence that has been presented?" Marcus attempted to stand, but seemed unsteady as he rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lacking any trace of its earlier authority, "there may be some technical irregularities in the documentation, but the essential facts remain unchanged regarding the division of assets and support obligations." But even as he spoke, Grace could see that his words carried no conviction. The confident businessman who had dominated the courtroom just an hour earlier had been replaced by someone who appeared to be desperately improvising responses to accusations he had never anticipated facing. Robert remained standing near the bench, his worn briefcase and humble appearance now seeming like carefully chosen camouflage rather than evidence of professional limitations. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe these revelations warrant a thorough examination of all claims and counterclaims in this matter. The defendant reserves the right to present additional evidence and testimony regarding Mr. Winters' pattern of misrepresentation and the true legal status of all parties involved." As the implications continued to settle over the courtroom, Grace found herself staring at Robert with new understanding. The gentle, overwhelmed public defender had been a carefully constructed facade designed to encourage exactly the kind of overconfidence and careless preparation that had led Marcus and his legal team into this devastating trap. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence as Judge Morrison reviewed the documents Robert had presented, her reading glasses reflecting the overhead lights as she carefully examined each page of evidence that was systematically destroying the foundation of Marcus's case. Victoria Ashford sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her earlier confidence replaced by the expression of someone watching a carefully constructed building collapse in slow motion. Robert Chun approached his worn briefcase once more, his movements now carrying the deliberate precision of someone who had been saving his most devastating evidence for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I believe the court should also be made aware of certain financial information that directly contradicts the plaintiff's characterization of my client's economic status and dependency." He withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the official logo of First National Trust Company, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the state. The envelope's weight and formal presentation suggested contents far more significant than anything that had been discussed during the previous proceedings. Grace watched in growing bewilderment as Robert broke the seal and removed a stack of documents that appeared to be official bank statements and legal certificates. She had no idea what financial information could possibly be relevant to her case, given that her own bank account contained less than $3,000 and her monthly expenses were entirely dependent on the modest allowance Marcus had provided throughout their relationship. "Your Honor," Robert continued, These are certified financial statements from First National Trust Company documenting the activation and current status of the Winters Family Trust, established on behalf of Grace Elizabeth Winters on June 14, 2019. The trust was funded with an initial deposit of $90 million and has been managed by professional investment advisors for the past 5 years. The numbers seemed to echo in the courtroom like a physical force, and Grace felt her vision blur slightly as she tried to process what Robert had just announced. $90 million was an amount so far beyond her comprehension that it felt like hearing about the national debt or the gross domestic product of a small country. Marcus shot to his feet, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing alarm. "That is impossible," he said, his voice cracking slightly with strain. "Grace has never had access to any significant financial resources. I have managed all of our household finances for 15 years. Robert turned toward Marcus with an expression of patient professionalism that somehow managed to convey devastating superiority without apparent effort. "Mr. Winters," he said, "I believe you will find that your management of household expenses is not the same thing as awareness of your partner's independent financial resources. The trust documentation clearly shows that Mrs. Winters was the sole beneficiary of a substantial family estate that was held in trust pending certain triggering events." He handed copies of the bank statements to Judge Morrison while simultaneously providing copies to the increasingly frantic plaintiff's legal team. According to the trust documents, one of the specified triggering events was the initiation of any legal proceeding that might affect Mrs. Winters' marital status or financial security. The trust was automatically activated when your divorce petition was filed with this court 3 weeks ago. Victoria Ashford grabbed the documents with shaking hands, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to show signs of stress as she absorbed the catastrophic implications of Robert's revelation. The bank statements were undeniably authentic, bearing official seals and signatures that would be impossible to forge, and the account balances showed not only the initial $90 million deposit, but additional growth from professional investment management over the past 5 years. But Robert was far from finished with his systematic destruction of everything Marcus and his legal team had assumed about Grace's financial position. "Your Honor," he said, withdrawing another set of documents from his seemingly endless supply of evidence, "I would also like to present property records showing that the Winters Family Trust holds significant real estate investments in this region, including commercial properties that may be of particular interest to this proceeding." Judge Morrison accepted the new documents with growing amazement, clearly recognizing that she was witnessing one of the most dramatic reversals in legal fortune she had seen during her years on the bench. "Mr. Chun," she said, "these are extraordinary claims that seem to contradict everything that has been presented regarding your client's financial circumstances." Robert nodded respectfully. "Your Honor, I understand the court's surprise, but I believe you will find that Mrs. Winters' family has a long history of discretion regarding their financial affairs. The trust was established by her late grandfather, Harrison Blackwood, who built a substantial fortune in commercial real estate development during the 1970s and 1980s. The name Harrison Blackwood seemed to trigger recognition in Judge Morrison's expression, and Grace noticed that even the court reporter had momentarily stopped her transcription to look up with obvious interest. Harrison Blackwood had been a legendary figure in regional development, responsible for several major commercial projects that had shaped the economic landscape of 3 counties. Robert continued his revelation with methodical precision. "According to the property records I am presenting to the court, the Blackwood estate, now operating as the Winters Family Trust, owns the Riverside Commerce Center where Mr. Winters' company, Winters Technical Solutions, has maintained its primary offices for the past 8 years." The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow, and Grace watched her supposed husband's face drain of color as he realized the implications. His successful business empire had been operating from property owned by Grace's family, meaning that his rent payments had been flowing directly into the trust fund that supported the woman he was now trying to portray as a financial dependent. Victoria was now frantically consulting her laptop, clearly attempting to verify the property ownership claims through online records. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing desperation as she realized that Robert's documentation was not only accurate, but represented just the tip of an iceberg of financial relationships that had been hidden from Marcus throughout their entire relationship. Jonathan Sterling had abandoned any pretense of professional composure and was conferring urgently with David Pike in whispers that were becoming increasingly audible throughout the courtroom. Grace caught fragments of their conversation that suggested they were discovering additional properties and business connections that made Marcus's supposed financial independence look like an elaborate facade. Robert allowed the courtroom to absorb these revelations before delivering what appeared to be his most devastating piece of evidence. "Your Honor," he said, "these financial records also document a series of business loans and credit guarantees that were provided to Winters Technical Solutions during its early development period. The funding that allowed Mr. Winters to expand his business and achieve his current level of success was secured through guarantees provided by the Blackwood estate." Marcus stared at Robert in growing horror as the full scope of his situation became clear. Not only had Grace never been financially dependent on him, but his own business success had been built on the foundation of financial backing provided by her family's wealth. Every confident statement he had made about his independent achievements was being systematically revealed as the product of support systems he had never even known existed. The documents Robert presented to the court showed a complex web of financial relationships that had operated behind the scenes throughout Marcus's supposedly self-made rise to success. Equipment financing, expansion loans, and even the initial seed capital for his business had all been facilitated through connections and guarantees that traced back to Grace's family fortune. Victoria made one desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice lacking any trace of its earlier authority, "even accepting these financial documents at face value, there remain questions about the timing of their presentation and the defendant's failure to disclose these resources during discovery." Robert's response was swift and devastating. "Ms. Ashford," he replied, "you will find that all relevant financial information was properly disclosed during discovery, but your client chose to focus exclusively on household bank accounts and readily visible assets. The trust documentation was available through public records searches that your team apparently chose not to conduct." He gestured toward the stack of evidence that now covered most of the defense table. Furthermore, Mrs. Winters was under no legal obligation to educate Mr. Winters about the existence of financial resources that he had never inquired about and that were not relevant to their day-to-day household management. Judge Morrison was now studying the bank statements with obvious fascination, clearly trying to process the extraordinary reversal of circumstances that had transformed what appeared to be a routine divorce proceeding into a complex case involving substantial family wealth and sophisticated financial structures. Marcus attempted one final protest, his voice carrying the desperation of someone watching 15 years of assumptions crumble in real time. "Your Honor," he said, "Grace never mentioned any family money or trust funds during our entire relationship. If these accounts existed, why would she have lived such a modest lifestyle while I was working 70-hour weeks to build our financial security?" Robert turned toward Marcus with an expression of patient sympathy that somehow managed to be more devastating than outright contempt. "Mr. Winters," he said, "perhaps you should consider the possibility that Mrs. Winters valued your relationship for reasons that had nothing to do with financial security. The trust documents show that she had access to unlimited financial resources throughout your relationship, but chose to live modestly and allow you to believe that you were providing for her welfare." The implication was staggering in its emotional impact. Grace had not only been financially independent throughout their relationship, but she had deliberately maintained the illusion of dependence in order to protect Marcus's pride and sense of accomplishment. Every grateful expression for his financial support, every careful management of household expenses, had been an elaborate performance designed to preserve his belief that he was the successful provider in their relationship. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to find some angle of attack that might salvage her case. "Your Honor," she said, "these revelations raise serious questions about fraud and misrepresentation that may require investigation by appropriate authorities." But Robert was ready for that argument as well. "Ms. Ashford," he replied, "I believe you will find that maintaining discretion about one's family financial affairs is not fraud, particularly when the other party never asked direct questions about such resources. Mrs. Winters was under no legal obligation to volunteer information about assets that were held in trust and managed by professional advisors. As the full implications of Robert's revelations continued to settle over the courtroom, Grace found herself staring at the bank statements that bore her name and an account balance that would allow her to purchase Marcus's entire business empire several times over. She realized that throughout their entire relationship, she could have solved every financial challenge he faced with a single phone call, but had chosen instead to watch him struggle and succeed through his own efforts. The confident businessman who had entered the courtroom that morning expecting to divide his hard-earned assets with a dependent housewife was now facing the reality that his supposed dependent had been quietly subsidizing his success from the beginning, while possessing the financial resources to buy and sell him like a commodity. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence as the full implications of Robert's revelations continued to reverberate through the space like aftershocks from a massive earthquake. Judge Morrison set down the trust documents and looked toward the defense table with an expression that had transformed from judicial skepticism to something approaching professional admiration for the most complete legal reversal she had witnessed in 23 years on the bench. Marcus sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, his expensive suit now appearing like an ill-fitting costume as he struggled to process the complete demolition of everything he had believed about his relationship, his success, and his legal position. The confident businessman who had entered the courtroom expecting to graciously divide his hard-earned assets with a dependent housewife now faced the reality that he had been financially supported by the very woman he was attempting to portray as worthless. Victoria Ashford stared at the bank statements bearing Grace's name with the expression of someone watching her professional reputation disintegrate in real time. Her perfectly applied makeup could not disguise the pallor that had crept across her features as she realized that her systematic humiliation of opposing counsel had been conducted in front of a client who possessed the financial resources to destroy her career with a single phone call to the right people. For the first time since the proceedings began, Grace Winters rose slowly from her seat. The movement itself seemed to command attention in a way that her previous stillness had not, and every person in the courtroom turned toward her with sudden focus. The woman who had sat silently through hours of character assassination and financial humiliation was undergoing a transformation that was visible in her posture, her expression, and the calm authority that now radiated from her presence. When Grace finally spoke, her voice carried none of the tentative uncertainty that everyone expected from someone who had been portrayed as incompetent and dependent. "Your Honor," she said, her tone clear and confident, "I believe it is time for me to address several misrepresentations that have been made during these proceedings." The sound of her voice seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. This was not the voice of a defeated housewife pleading for basic survival, but rather the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to with respect and attention. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, clearly recognizing that she was about to witness the conclusion of one of the most dramatic legal reversals of her career. Grace turned toward Marcus with an expression of calm disappointment rather than anger. "Mr. Winters," she said, using his formal name with deliberate precision, "your characterization of our relationship and my capabilities has been both inaccurate and unnecessarily cruel. I chose to maintain discretion about my family's financial resources because I valued what I believed was a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and affection." Marcus attempted to respond, but Grace raised one hand in a gesture that somehow commanded immediate silence. The movement was subtle but carried such natural authority that even Victoria Ashford found herself waiting for permission to speak. However, Grace continued, "Your conduct during these proceedings has demonstrated that you viewed our relationship as an opportunity for exploitation rather than partnership. Your willingness to publicly humiliate someone you claim to love reveals a character that I clearly misjudged during our time together." She turned toward Victoria with the kind of cold professionalism that suggested extensive experience in dealing with attorneys who had overestimated their position. "Ms. Ashford," Grace said, "your repeated attacks on my counsel's competence and your systematic attempts to humiliate both of us demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the actual power dynamics in this courtroom." Victoria opened her mouth to object, but Grace's next words cut through any attempt at interruption. I specifically requested that Robert Chun represent me in these proceedings because of his reputation for thorough preparation and his willingness to allow opponents to reveal their true character before presenting evidence that would completely destroy their position. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Robert Chun had not been assigned as Grace's public defender due to her financial limitations, but had been specifically chosen by someone with the resources to hire any attorney in the country. The gentle, overwhelmed public defender had been an elaborate performance designed to encourage exactly the kind of arrogance and careless preparation that had led Marcus and his legal team into this devastating trap. Grace gestured toward Robert with obvious respect and what appeared to be genuine friendship. Mr. Chun graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and spent 7 years with Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher before choosing to focus on pro bono work for clients who required sophisticated legal representation but preferred to maintain discretion about their resources. His decision to work through the public defender system allows certain clients to evaluate the true character of their opponents before revealing the full scope of their legal capabilities. Robert smiled for the first time since the proceedings began, and Grace noticed that his entire demeanor had shifted to match her own transformation. The worn briefcase and humble appearance now seemed like carefully chosen props rather than evidence of professional limitations, and his calm throughout the earlier humiliation took on new meaning as the patience of someone who knew exactly how the story would end. "Your Honor," Grace continued, turning back toward Judge Morrison with complete composure, "I would like to request that Mr. Winters be held responsible for all legal fees and court costs associated with these proceedings. His decision to pursue litigation based on fraudulent claims about both his marital status and my financial position represents a waste of judicial resources that should not be absorbed by the taxpayers." Judge Morrison nodded immediately, clearly recognizing both the justice and the legal precedent for such an award. "Granted," she said without hesitation. "Mr. Winters will be responsible for all court costs, filing fees, and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendant." The financial implications were staggering. Robert's actual billing rate at his former prestigious firm would have been well over $800 per hour, and the sophisticated legal research that had destroyed Marcus's case represented weeks of preparation by someone with the expertise to command premium compensation in the legal marketplace. Grace was not finished with her demands. "Furthermore, Your Honor, given Mr. Winters' systematic misrepresentation of his legal capacity to enter into marriage, I believe the appropriate remedy is a declaration that no valid marital relationship ever existed between us. This would preclude any claims he might have to shared custody of minor children or any form of ongoing legal connection." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Grace," he said, "you cannot simply erase 15 years of our life together. Whatever technical issues exist regarding our marriage ceremony, we built a family and a life that has meaning beyond legal documentation." Grace's response was delivered with surgical precision. "Mr. Winters," she replied, "you spent this entire proceeding attempting to demonstrate that I contributed nothing of value to your life or success. You have now learned that your business empire was built on foundations provided by my family's financial resources, that your office space was rented from properties owned by my trust, and that your supposed independence was an illusion maintained by systems you never even knew existed." She paused to let the full impact of these facts settle before delivering her final assessment. "Under these circumstances, I believe it would be most appropriate for you to focus on determining whether your business can survive without the ongoing subsidies and support structures that have operated behind the scenes throughout our relationship." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that its devastating implications took several seconds to register with everyone in the courtroom. Grace was not simply rejecting Marcus's claims for financial support. She was suggesting that her family might withdraw the business relationships and financial backing that had made his success possible in the first place. Victoria made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the complete wreckage of her case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now carrying none of its earlier authority, "perhaps there might be some basis for negotiating a modest settlement that would allow both parties to move forward without further litigation." Grace turned toward Victoria with the kind of dismissive glance usually reserved for persistent solicitors. "Ms. Ashford," She said, "Your client entered these proceedings claiming that I was entitled to $1,800 per month because of my supposed lack of contribution and capability. I believe that amount would be quite generous as his final settlement offer, should I decide to pursue any claims against him for misrepresentation and fraud." The reversal was complete and devastating. Grace was suggesting that Marcus, who had attempted to limit her to survival-level support, should consider himself fortunate to receive the same amount he had offered her as a gesture of forced charity. Judge Morrison was clearly struggling to maintain judicial composure as she witnessed what was certainly the most dramatic turnaround in legal fortune of her career. "Mr. Winters," she said, "do you have anything further to present to this court before I issue my ruling in this matter?" Marcus attempted to stand, but seemed unsteady as he rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized his earlier testimony, "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about the nature of our relationship and the legal issues involved." Grace's laugh was soft, but carried enough ice to freeze the courtroom atmosphere. "Mr. Winters," she said, "the only misunderstanding was your assumption that I would continue to subsidize your illusions of independence while allowing you to publicly humiliate me in pursuit of a settlement that would have represented pocket change for my monthly trust distributions." As the proceedings concluded with Judge Morrison's formal ruling in Grace's favor, the courtroom began to empty with the quiet efficiency of people who had witnessed something extraordinary and wanted to discuss it elsewhere. The two elderly spectators hurried toward the doors with expressions of amazement, clearly eager to share the story of the most dramatic legal reversal they had ever seen. Marcus gathered his papers with movements that seemed mechanical and defeated, his expensive suit now appearing like armor that had failed to protect him when it mattered most. Victoria and her team packed their materials in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the professional humiliation of being completely outmaneuvered by opponents they had systematically underestimated. As Grace and Robert prepared to leave the courtroom, she turned toward him with a smile that revealed the genuine friendship that had been disguised as a professional relationship between strangers. "Robert," she said, "I believe lunch at the club would be appropriate to celebrate another successful conclusion to what could have been a very unpleasant proceeding." Robert's response carried the warmth of someone who had known Grace for years rather than weeks. "Grace," he replied, "your patience with my performance today was remarkable. I was beginning to worry that Ms. Ashford might actually convince me that I was incompetent." They walked toward the courthouse doors together, their conversation carrying the easy familiarity of old friends who had successfully executed a complex plan. Behind them, Marcus stood alone at the plaintiff's table, staring at the settlement documents that would require him to pay legal fees that exceeded his annual income, while facing the reality that his business empire might not survive without the hidden support systems he had never known existed. Outside the courthouse, a black sedan waited with its engine running and a uniformed driver who opened the rear door as Grace approached. As she settled into the leather interior, Grace looked back toward the courthouse steps where Marcus emerged alone, his confident stride replaced by the uncertain movements of someone who no longer knew what the future held. Through the tinted windows, Grace watched as her former partner stood on the courthouse steps, checking his phone with the desperate movements of someone hoping for good news that would not come. Within 6 months, Winters Technical Solutions would face a series of mysterious setbacks as equipment leases were terminated, office space became unavailable, and client relationships that had seemed secure began to evaporate without explanation. The confident businessman who had entered the courthouse that morning expecting to generously divide his hard-earned assets with a dependent housewife was learning the difference between earned success and success that had been quietly facilitated by resources he had never imagined existed. I hope this story of justice and hidden truth resonated with you as much as it did for everyone in that courtroom. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone who seemed powerless revealed their true strength? Or perhaps experienced your own moment of turning the tables on someone who underestimated you? Share your thoughts in the comments about times when patience and preparation led to the perfect moment of sweet, satisfying justice.